This 1889 photo of triplet sisters seems innocent until you know what they had done to their mother. Three young women stand beside their modest Missouri farmhouse, wearing matching Sunday dresses, their hair identically braided. Cordelia, Ophelia, and Delia Whitmore appear to be respectable farm girls posing for a typical family portrait. But when genealogist Margaret Chen examined the Whitmore family records in 2019, she discovered something chilling. The sisters' mother, Prudence Whitmore, had completely vanished from all official records just months after this photograph was taken. No death certificate, no burial record, no explanation. Then Margaret found a handwritten note in the margins of a church registry that made her blood run cold. The Whitmore girls, God help their souls. What she uncovered next revealed a truth far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The three sisters had done something unspeakable to their own mother, something that would remain hidden in the Missouri Ozarks for over a century. How many other family portraits are concealing similar secrets, and what really happened to Prudence Whitmore in the months after this innocent-looking photograph was taken? If this story has sparked your interest in the hidden truths of history, consider subscribing to our channel to help keep hidden histories alive. And comment your city and local time. We're interested to know how far these documented accounts travel. In the autumn of 1889, as the first frost touched the Missouri Ozarks, three young women stood motionless beside their modest wooden farmhouse for what would become one of the most haunting family portraits in American history. Cordelia, Ophelia, and Delia Whitmore, identical triplets of 19 years, wore matching dark Sunday dresses that their mother, Prudence, had sewn by hand during the long winter months. Their hair was braided in precisely the same pattern, three dark ropes hanging over their shoulders like synchronized pendulums. To the traveling photographer who captured this moment, they appeared to be nothing more than typical rural daughters posing dutifully for a family portrait, their serious expressions reflecting the solemnity expected of proper young women in that era. The Whitmore homestead sat isolated among the rolling hills of Stone County, Missouri, where survival depended on hard work, self-reliance, and the unforgiving rhythms of subsistence farming. Here, in this remote corner of the Ozarks, families lived by their own rules, far from the reach of outside authorities or social oversight. The nearest neighbor lived nearly 2 miles away through dense woodland, and the county seat required a full day's journey by wagon over treacherous mountain paths. It was a place where family business remained strictly within family walls, where secrets could fester in isolation, and where the bonds between blood relatives could become twisted into something far darker than love. The harsh realities of Ozark life in the late 19th century had shaped the Whitmore family in ways that would have horrified more civilized society. Ezekiel Whitmore, the family patriarch, had died the previous year under circumstances that the local coroner had diplomatically recorded as consumption, though whispered rumors among the scattered neighbors spoke of something far more troubling. Those who had known Ezekiel described him as a man consumed by rage and alcohol, a domestic tyrant who ruled his household through fear and violence. His wife Prudence bore the visible scars of his brutality, while his three daughters had learned to move and speak as a single unit, their individual personalities subsumed into a collective survival mechanism that unnerved anyone who encountered them. The photograph itself reveals subtle clues that a casual observer might have missed, details that would later prove crucial to understanding the tragedy that was already unfolding when the shutter clicked. The sisters stand with identical posture, their hands positioned in precisely the same manner, their heads tilted at matching angles. More disturbing still is the way they seem to occupy the same emotional space, their expressions not merely similar, but unnaturally synchronized, as if three separate minds had somehow merged into a single consciousness. Their eyes hold a quality that contemporary observers would have found deeply unsettling, a vacant intensity that suggested they were seeing something far beyond the photographer's lens. Behind them, the farmhouse itself tells a story of increasing isolation and decay. The windows that should have welcomed afternoon sunlight are heavily curtained, blocking any view of the interior. The front porch, once a gathering place for family socializing, appears abandoned, with broken railings and warped boards that speak of neglect and withdrawal from the world. Most tellingly, there is no sign of their mother Prudence in the photograph, despite family portraits of that era, typically including all available household members. Her absence from this formal documentation of the family would later prove to be the first clue in unraveling the horrifying truth of what had already begun. In 2019, more than a century after this photograph was taken, genealogist Margaret Chen was conducting routine family research for a client when she stumbled upon the Whitmore family records and immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong. The 1890 census listed only the three sisters as heads of household, a highly unusual arrangement for unmarried women of that era. More disturbing still, their mother Prudence Whitmore had simply vanished from all official documentation after 1889, leaving no trace in death certificates, burial records, or local newspaper obituaries. It was as if she had been deliberately erased from history, her existence scrubbed away by hands that wanted no questions asked. Margaret's trained eye for genealogical anomalies led her to examine church records, property transfers, and county correspondence, where she discovered a pattern of carefully constructed lies and systematic concealment that spoke of something far more sinister than simple record-keeping errors. The Whitmore sisters had told elaborate stories about their mother's declining health, her need for complete isolation, and her supposed decision to cut all ties with the outside world. But beneath these explanations lay a web of deception so carefully crafted that it had successfully hidden the truth for over 100 years, protecting a secret so dark that it would challenge everything we thought we knew about family loyalty, protection, and the devastating legacy of abuse. Margaret Chen's investigation into the Whitmore family mystery began with what should have been a routine genealogical search, but quickly transformed into something far more disturbing when she realized that Prudence Whitmore, a 43-year-old woman in apparent good health, had simply ceased to exist in the historical record after late 1889. The marriage certificate from 1869 showed that Prudence had wed Ezekiel Whitmore in a simple ceremony at the Stone County Courthouse, and birth records confirmed the extraordinary arrival of identical triplets in 1870, a medical rarity that would have made the family locally famous in their small community. Yet after decades of documented presence in census records, church registries, and local merchant accounts, Prudence's name disappeared entirely from all official documentation, as if she had been deliberately erased by someone who understood exactly which records needed to be altered. The first concrete evidence that something terrible had occurred came from county property records, which revealed a highly unusual transfer of ownership that violated every social convention of the era. In January of 1890, just months after the family portrait was taken, the entire Whitmore homestead was transferred exclusively to the three daughters, bypassing the normal inheritance patterns that would have required legal guardianship for unmarried women or temporary administration by male relatives. This unprecedented arrangement required special approval from county officials, yet the supporting documentation that should have explained the circumstances had been mysteriously lost or destroyed, leaving only the bare legal transfer as evidence of what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated deception. Margaret's research into Ezekiel Whitmore's death revealed another layer of disturbing questions that suggested the family's troubles had begun long before Prudence's disappearance. While his death certificate listed consumption as the cause, A handwritten note in the county coroner's files mentioned suspicious circumstances never fully investigated due to remote location and family's refusal to cooperate with questioning. A neighbor's statement, preserved in the sheriff's correspondence, described Ezekiel as a man of violent temper who kept his family like prisoners in their own home, forbidding visitors and preventing his wife and daughters from attending church or social gatherings. The isolation that had once protected the family's privacy had now become a shield for something far more sinister. The breakthrough in Margaret's investigation came when she discovered the preserved diary of Reverend Samuel Hartwell, a traveling minister whose circuit included the remote homesteads of Stone County. His entry from November of 1889 provided the most chilling contemporary account of the Whitmore sisters' behavior and their mother's mysterious absence. Reverend Hartwell wrote with growing alarm about his visit to the homestead, describing how the three sisters moved and spoke in perfect unison, finishing each other's sentences and responding to his questions with identical phrases delivered in unnaturally synchronized voices. When he inquired about their mother's whereabouts, hoping to offer spiritual comfort to the recently widowed woman, the sisters responded with disturbing uniformity that she was resting in the root cellar and could not be disturbed under any circumstances. The Reverend's detailed observations painted a picture of a household operating under rules that defied normal human behavior. He noted that the sisters never looked directly at him during conversation, instead focusing their gaze on some invisible point beyond his shoulder, and that they moved through their daily tasks with mechanical precision that suggested they were following a predetermined script rather than responding naturally to their environment. Most troubling of all was the smell that permeated the house, which Reverend Hartwell described as the odor of decay and confinement, as if something had been sealed away from fresh air and sunlight for far too long. His attempts to visit the root cellar were met with increasingly agitated responses from the sisters, who insisted that their mother required complete isolation for her health, and that any disturbance might prove fatal to her delicate condition. The Reverend's growing suspicions were confirmed when he attempted to engage the sisters in normal conversation about their mother's illness, only to discover that they provided identical answers to his questions, using the exact same phrases and vocal inflections as if they had rehearsed their responses extensively. Their explanation for Prudence's condition changed subtly throughout the conversation, first describing her as physically ill, then mentally disturbed, and finally as requiring protective isolation from the outside world that might trigger dangerous episodes. These contradictions, combined with their unnatural behavior and the disturbing atmosphere of the house, convinced Reverend Hartwell that something terrible was occurring within the Whitmore household. Though the isolation of their location and the sisters' unified front made investigation nearly impossible. The final entry in the Reverend's diary regarding the Whitmore family carried a note of desperate frustration and moral anguish. He had reported his concerns to both the county sheriff and the local church leadership, only to be told that interfering in family matters required concrete evidence of wrongdoing that simply did not exist in the legal sense. The sisters had successfully created a barrier of plausible explanations and social expectations that protected them from official scrutiny, while their remote location and their community's reluctance to involve outside authorities in local affairs provided additional layers of protection for whatever dark secret they were hiding in the depths of their family's root cellar. The conspiracy of silence that protected the Whitmore sisters extended far beyond their isolated homestead, reaching into the very heart of Stone County's social and legal institutions, where men in positions of authority chose willful blindness over uncomfortable truths. Sheriff Thomas McCready's correspondence with County Judge William Hartfield reveals the frustrating reality of rural law enforcement in the 1890s, where official investigations could be stymied by community resistance and the sacred nature of family privacy. In a letter dated March of 1890, Sheriff McCready wrote with barely contained frustration, "The neighbors won't speak directly about what they suspect, but all hint at something terrible happening in that house. Problem is proving it when the whole community wants it buried and the law requires evidence that these people are determined never to provide." The sheriff's attempts to investigate the Whitmore situation were systematically undermined by a network of local residents who had convinced themselves that protecting the sisters was more important than uncovering the truth about their mother's disappearance. Merchants who had previously conducted regular business with Prudence Whitmore suddenly claimed they had never noticed her absence, while church members who had worshipped alongside her for decades insisted they had always known she was poorly and required complete isolation. This coordinated deception was not the result of any organized conspiracy, but rather the organic response of a tight-knit community that instinctively closed ranks against outside scrutiny, even when that scrutiny might have prevented a terrible injustice. Margaret Chen's research into medical records provided the most damning evidence of official negligence and community complicity in the Whitmore family's descent into tragedy. At the Missouri State Archives, she discovered the patient files of Dr. Elias Brennan, the county's only physician, whose notes from October of 1889 documented a visit to examine Prudence Whitmore that should have triggered immediate intervention from local authorities. Dr. Brennan's clinical observations were stark and unambiguous. Patient severely malnourished, weight approximately 80 pounds, consistent with prolonged food deprivation. Multiple contusions and abrasions on wrists and ankles suggest restraint with rope or chain. Patient claims daughters preventing her from leaving home, insists she is being held against her will in basement storage area. Daughters present during examination insist mother suffers from mental derangement, requiring protective supervision. The physician's notes reveal a man torn between his medical oath and the social pressures of his community, documenting clear evidence of abuse while simultaneously accepting the sisters' explanations that their mother's condition resulted from self-neglect due to mental illness. Dr. Brennan recorded his recommendation that Prudence be removed from the home for proper medical care, but also noted the sisters' unified refusal to allow such intervention and their insistence that moving their mother would worsen her delicate mental state. Most tellingly, the doctor's final note on the case stated, "Family situation highly irregular, but daughters appear devoted to mother's care. Will monitor situation closely," though no subsequent visits were ever recorded. The systematic isolation of Prudence Whitmore became clear through Margaret's examination of financial records that showed how methodically the sisters had severed their mother's connections to the outside world. Bank records revealed that after Ezekiel's death, the sisters had taken complete control of the family's modest savings and monthly pension payments, closing accounts that Prudence had maintained independently and consolidating all financial resources under their joint control. They canceled their mother's long-standing donations to the Methodist Church, claiming her illness made such expenses burdensome, and stopped the monthly letters she had exchanged with her sister in Arkansas, explaining to the postmaster that correspondence excited her mother's nervous condition. Local merchants who had known Prudence for decades were gradually informed that she could no longer receive visitors due to her deteriorating health, and that all household business would now be conducted exclusively through her devoted daughters. The sisters presented themselves as selfless caregivers, making tremendous sacrifices to protect their mother's fragile condition, a narrative that allowed the community to feel comfortable ignoring the growing signs that something was terribly wrong. This carefully constructed fiction was so convincing that when Prudence's sister in Arkansas sent worried letters asking about her sudden silence, The community rallied to support the sisters' story, with the local postmaster and several neighbors writing testimonials about the girls' admirable dedication to their suffering mother. Modern psychological analysis of the historical evidence reveals patterns that contemporary experts recognize as consistent with shared psychotic disorder, a rare but documented condition where delusional beliefs are transmitted between closely bonded individuals, often triggered by severe trauma or prolonged isolation. Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case files, noted that the Whitmore sisters displayed classic symptoms of this condition, including their synchronized speech patterns, identical behavioral responses, and shared conviction that their actions were protective rather than harmful. The years of abuse they had witnessed and experienced under their father's reign of terror had created a psychological bond so intense that they literally shared the same distorted perception of reality, making it impossible for them to recognize that their efforts to protect their mother had become the very thing that was destroying her. The sisters' ability to maintain their delusional narrative was reinforced by a community that preferred comfortable lies to disturbing truths, creating a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction and social enablement that would ultimately cost Prudence Whitmore her life while protecting her daughters from the consequences of their actions for more than a century. The breakthrough that would finally expose the truth about Prudence Whitmore's fate came from the most unlikely source, a neighbor who had carried the burden of terrible knowledge for nearly 2 years before finding the courage to speak. Martha Henley, whose farm bordered the Whitmore property to the east, had maintained a cautious friendship with Prudence throughout the long years of Ezekiel's abuse, often providing small acts of kindness and support when the isolated woman desperately needed human connection. In 1891, after moving away from Stone County to live with her married daughter in Arkansas, Martha finally broke her silence by filing a sworn affidavit with authorities there, her distance from the community giving her the safety she needed to reveal what she had witnessed during those terrible autumn months of 1889. Martha's testimony painted a horrifying picture of a woman's desperate attempts to call for help, while her own daughters held her captive in conditions that defied human decency. Her affidavit described hearing Prudence's voice crying out from what sounded like beneath the Whitmore house during the late evening hours of October and November 1889, her calls for help growing progressively weaker as the weeks passed. When Martha had approached the sisters to ask about these disturbing sounds, they responded with their characteristic synchronized explanation that their mother was suffering from one of her spells and required isolation in the root cellar for her own safety and the protection of others. The sisters' ability to deliver this explanation in perfect unison, using identical words and inflections, had convinced Martha that something profoundly unnatural was occurring within the Whitmore household. The most chilling aspect of Martha's testimony concerned her final conversation with Prudence, which occurred through a small ventilation grate that connected the root cellar to the outside of the house. In late November of 1889, Martha had heard weak tapping sounds coming from beneath the ground near the foundation and discovered that someone was trying to communicate from inside the sealed cellar. When she pressed her ear to the grate, she heard Prudence's voice, barely above a whisper, begging for water and pleading to be released from what she described as a dark, cold prison where her daughters had placed her for her own protection. Prudence's confused explanation revealed the tragic psychology behind her imprisonment, as she alternated between defending her daughter's actions and desperately asking for help to escape their care. Martha's account of that final conversation revealed the complete psychological breakdown that the sisters' twisted logic had created in their mother's mind. Prudence told Martha that her daughters had convinced her that the outside world was dangerous, that people wanted to hurt her, and that only by remaining hidden could she stay safe from the violence that had destroyed her husband. Yet in the same breath, she begged Martha to bring her food and water, explaining that her daughters sometimes forgot to care for her properly because they were so focused on protecting her from imaginary threats. The tragic irony of Prudence's situation became clear through Martha's testimony. She had been convinced by her traumatized daughters that their abuse was actually protection, making her complicit in her own imprisonment, even as it slowly killed her. The sisters themselves provided the most damning evidence of their actions through a letter they wrote to their aunt in Arkansas, a piece of correspondence that Martha had helped them compose and mail in December of 1889. The letter, preserved in the family papers that Margaret Chen discovered during her investigation, demonstrated the calculated nature of their deception and their complete inability to recognize the horror of what they were doing to their mother. Written in Cordelia's careful handwriting, but signed by all three sisters, the letter explained to their concerned aunt that Prudence had taken gravely ill with a nervous condition that required complete isolation from all outside contact. They described themselves as devoted caregivers, making tremendous sacrifices to provide their mother with the protection and quiet she needed to recover from her mental affliction. The letter's language revealed the sisters' genuine belief that they were performing an act of mercy rather than perpetrating a crime, describing their mother's condition in clinical terms that suggested they had convinced themselves she was mentally incompetent and required their protective supervision. They wrote of monitoring her carefully to prevent episodes of violence or self-harm, of providing her with a safe, quiet environment away from the stimulation that might worsen her condition, and of their determination to care for her, no matter how difficult or demanding that care might become. The letter concluded with a request that their aunt not attempt to visit, as any excitement or disruption to their mother's routine might prove fatal to her delicate mental state. The physical evidence that would ultimately confirm Martha Henley's testimony and expose the full horror of the sisters' actions lay hidden beneath the Whitmore house for over a century, waiting for modern investigative techniques to reveal the truth. In 1995, during renovation of the abandoned Whitmore property by new owners who planned to restore the historic farmhouse, construction workers discovered human remains in a sealed section of what had once served as the family's root cellar. Forensic analysis revealed that the remains belonged to a middle-aged woman who had died of malnutrition and dehydration, her final days spent in a cramped, airless space that measured barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with evidence suggesting she had been confined there for weeks or possibly months before her death. The complete truth about Prudence Whitmore's death emerged through a combination of forensic evidence and a deathbed confession that revealed the tragic psychology behind one of the most disturbing family crimes in Missouri history. The skeletal remains discovered in 1995 were positively identified through dental records that Dr. Elias Brennan had meticulously maintained in his patient files, confirming that Prudence had indeed died in the makeshift prison her daughters had constructed in their root cellar. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Harrison, who examined the remains, determined that death had occurred sometime in late November or early December of 1889, caused by severe malnutrition and dehydration that suggested prolonged confinement without adequate food or water. The positioning of the remains and evidence of scratch marks on the wooden walls indicated that Prudence had spent her final days desperately trying to escape the cramped space where her daughters had placed her for what they believed was her own protection. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source that had remained hidden for decades in the personal effects of Cordelia Whitmore, the last surviving sister and apparent leader of the tragic trio. In 1923, following Cordelia's death from pneumonia at the age of 53, local authorities discovered a handwritten letter among her possessions that served as a complete confession to their mother's death and revealed the twisted logic that had driven their actions. The letter, apparently written during Cordelia's final illness, when guilt and approaching death had finally broken through the delusions that had sustained her for over 3 decades, provided a first-hand account of the events that had led to Prudence's imprisonment and death. Cordelia's confession revealed that the sisters' actions had been motivated by a genuine but tragically misguided desire to protect their mother from what they perceived as continued threats to her safety. The letter explained that after witnessing years of their father's brutal abuse, the sisters had developed an obsessive fear that their mother remained in constant danger from outside forces that might harm her as Ezekiel had done. When Prudence began showing signs of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, anxiety attacks, and periods of confusion, her daughters interpreted these symptoms as evidence that she was still under attack from invisible enemies who sought to destroy her mind and spirit. The confession detailed how the sisters had convinced themselves that the only way to keep their mother truly safe was to place her in the root cellar, which they had modified with blankets and personal belongings to create what they believed was a secure refuge from the hostile world above. Cordelia's letter revealed their sincere belief that they were providing their mother with the ultimate protection, a place where no one could hurt her, and where she could heal from the trauma that their father's abuse had inflicted upon her fragile psyche. The sisters had planned to care for her in this underground sanctuary, bringing her food and water regularly while shielding her from any contact with the outside world that might trigger memories of her suffering. The tragic irony of their plan became clear through Cordelia's anguished admission that they had forgotten to take care of her proper, a phrase that revealed both their genuine love for their mother and their complete inability to recognize that their protection had become deadly neglect. The letter described how the sisters' own psychological trauma had made them incapable of providing adequate care, as they became so focused on maintaining the secrecy of their mother's location that they began to neglect her basic physical needs. Their shared delusion that Prudence was safely hidden from harm prevented them from recognizing that she was actually dying from the very isolation they had created to protect her. The confession revealed that by the time the sisters realized their mother was seriously ill, they had become so committed to their narrative of protection that they could not acknowledge the reality of what was happening. Cordelia wrote that they had convinced themselves that Prudence's weakness was a temporary condition that would improve once she had fully recovered from her mental distress, and that bringing outside help would only expose her to the dangers they had worked so hard to prevent. Their inability to distinguish between protection and imprisonment, combined with their fear of revealing what they had done, created a psychological trap that made it impossible for them to save their mother, even when they began to understand that something was terribly wrong. The fate of the 3 sisters following their mother's death illustrated the long-term consequences of untreated trauma and the isolation that had shaped their entire worldview. All 3 women lived as recluses for the remainder of their lives, never marrying, never leaving Stone County, and maintaining their synchronized existence until death finally separated them. Ophelia died first during the influenza pandemic of 1918, followed by Delia in 1920 from pneumonia, and finally Cordelia in 1923. Neighbors remembered them as strange but harmless old women who spoke in unison and moved as a single unit. Their identical mannerisms and synchronized behavior continuing to unnerve visitors until their deaths. The community's protective silence had successfully shielded the sisters from legal consequences, but it had also trapped them in a psychological prison that prevented any possibility of healing or redemption. Their story became a cautionary tale about the devastating effects of family violence and the importance of community intervention, though it would take more than a century for the full truth to emerge and for Prudence Whitmore to finally receive the justice and recognition that had been denied to her in life.